All right, welcome to our LEC correspondent, Daniel Drakos, LEC caster, if you don't know. He is actually an American that we embedded in Europe many years ago for this point.
To activate at this moment.
To deliver us the secret intel on the European teams for MSI so that we may destroy them. Hello and welcome to The Dive, Season 8, Episode 14. Mark Zimmerman is back as a permanent host forever.
Spring Split didn't go so well, got demoted already.
Welcome back, Mark. How's it going?
Good. Happy to sub in to Azael for the intro before you guys get into your MSI stuff.
Yeah, this is going to be a fun episode. If you are watching right now, we're going to do a quick little intro with some news, and then we are going to have some correspondence from all of the other major regions to check in. But first up with our news, Fearless Draft. Now, I know you're positive on Fearless Draft. I'm positive on Fearless Draft too. Some of the details that have come up with this recent announcement with LPL rumored to possibly be implementing Fearless Draft is that people are discussing like real Fearless Draft, where you ban out all the champions that have actually been picked in the game from getting picked again, or the common that we've seen implemented already, where it's just like pseudo and you're only banning out the winning ones, and then the other team just picks those champions anyways.
I want to see just more bans. I think the whole point of the Fearless Drafts is just to get different champs in the game. I want to see anything banned or picked just gone for the rest of it.
I'm on that side.
Dude, we have like, what, 170 champions almost? Like, surely we can afford to not have half them in. It's fine. There's other stuff to play. Like, just do it.
So officially, I have nothing to comment on this.
Okay.
On a product lead level,
Unofficially, what you got?
No news. No news to share. No official opinions. But I think the goal and like what Fearless is doing is worth discussing, because I think there's more. Like, I think one, change for the sake of change is kind of cool in general in this space. Like, people like seeing fresh new things, and I think wanting more diversity is a noble goal. And I think Fearless does do that, and so in a sense, it's a cool concept. I don't think it does it very cleanly, and I don't think it does it in a way where I'd be like, that's the final way to accomplish that goal. Because I don't think some of the things you're highlighting, like the problems is in best of 3, it doesn't manifest that much unless you do like this full, everything you picked is gone now. Otherwise, it's like you play Azir, then I play Azir, and then game 3, it's Azael Orianna. And it's like, do we really see anything that different? I don't know. So I think it doesn't quite move the needle far enough unless you do it that way. And then in best of 5s, it's like, oh my God, game 5 is just going to be like the most important game in the series, the game decider, and people are on like their 10th champion.
Yeah, that's sick. That's awesome.
I think that starts to move the needle too far away from like true competition, which is like the game played at the highest level, which is why people are watching. So like that's where I'm like, I don't know if Fearless is really accomplishing what it's trying to do. And this is me speaking on a personal level.
I get that, but I don't know. I feel like the biggest criticism for watching pro play that I've heard forever is you're watching the same game every time. Like, sure, it's competitive. Like, it's not easy to do that, but like, if it's literally the same game, the same safe champions, nothing happening early game, stacking dragons, it's like, let's see something new.
So my argument on the getting away from the peak of competition basically is that, number one, you will have had one game at the beginning of the series where you did see best meta champions being played. Of course, then, one of the teams was on blue side, but then, that's part of good coaching staff and part of the strategy.
Blue side is good coaching staff?
Dealing with the blue side.
Dealing with one team gets,
Okay.
I mean, you got to be a good coin flipper, right?
True.
That's how you pick your coaches. Sorry, I kind of skipped ahead there. But, one of the parts of good coaching staff will be adapting to some of these, and there is going to be a huge advantage to blue side. But also, is that what the majority of people want to see? Or do the majority of people, would they be more entertained by seeing a bunch of extra variety? Because we do want to have it as fair as possible. So maybe there's some, like you're saying, adjustments. This might not be the best way to do it, to make it, to kind of balance out that beginning like blue side first pick type of thing, but still incorporate a lot of variety here if we're like perma-banning champs and stuff like that. But I think the entertainment factor, more and more people are realizing how important that variety and entertainment factor is in the longevity and health of leagues. Now that we've been going for so long, and so many players have been watching League of Legends for a really long time.
Yeah, I think Fearless is a great concept and something to test and try and experiment. But my only perception is I don't know if it's the final thing because it doesn't work in best of ones, and it kind of, you have to have different rules for best of 3 and best of 5, and when your playoffs break and what you're doing in your regular season, it becomes a very limiting format.
Yep.
And that's where I say the concerns are with it. And I think that there's a final shape beyond what Fearless is that could hit all these goals and have more flexibility. That is what I think is where, but that doesn't mean don't do it or that it's bad or anything. It's just, I think there's more to be done with the concept of diversity in League.
Cool. So we're going to be having a new and improved, better Fearless, Ultimate Omega Fearless in LCS in summer, ready to go with all these tweaks worked out. Glad we could wrap that up with official commentary from our commissioner, Mark Zimmerman, and we'll get on to another one. LCS rumors dropped from your good buddy, old pal, Travis Gafford on rumored LCS best of 3s. Any official comments?
Nope, no comments.
Okay. What about you?
What about unofficial comments?
No unofficial comments on this one. I had unofficial comments on Fearless, not on best of 3. Nothing to say about this at all.
Okay. So,
Okay.
Well, let's go to Medios then. What's your take, buddy?
Best of 3. Yeah, I mean, I think it's better than best of 1 generally. It kind of gives you more experience for teams because, I mean, best of 1, it has its place. You know, it's cool. Random upsets can happen and stuff, but I don't know. I think best of 3 definitely tests you a lot more. And I just, regardless of format, I would just like to see more games. That's it for me. LCS felt really short this split, which sucked because it was so fun to watch. I really enjoy when LCS comes around, but it's there and it's gone. So I just want more games. That's it.
Maybe that's part of it. It's they leave you wanting more, and you want it even more because it's scarce.
Nah, they could give me more too.
You also have been a pretty big proponent and outspoken about best of 2s, like this double header idea as well. Do you want to try and sell that one?
I mean, I've said it before, but I think it's the best format for regular season games because it's just more games and you don't have to worry about scheduling stuff, right? Say you can play 6 games in a given day, right? That's 2 best of 3s, and that could still be 4 games, but you do a back-to-back double header, whatever you want to call it, and you know your schedule, you know how long it's going to take. So
yeah.
I think that's good. I think also people say oh, we don't like ties and whatever, but I don't know. I think that's kind of whatever because it's just you go 1-1. It's not it wasn't a tournament placing or whatever. It's just the 2 top teams meet and one team wins the first game, the other team wins the second game. I feel like that kind of makes their matchup later on going into playoffs something even more hype. It's okay, these guys were even last time they met. Let's see who can win this time. So I think it's cool, but yeah, it definitely seems not something that is super popular.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, though. I think a lot of people are yes, we get more games, in whatever kind of format that comes in. And best of 3s are exciting. To me, the main draw, obviously, is that your intensity builds over your best of 3. So I think that is probably, for me, going to be the biggest difference, whereas if it's best of 1 and a best of 1 and a best of 1, it's just about which teams are playing, which ones you're more excited to see or whatever. But in a best of 3, no matter who's playing, I always get more drawn in and more excited as the series goes on. It's one of the most constant viewership trends is that during any best of series, literally always up and to the right, no matter who's playing. Maybe you start at a lower place if it's a less interesting team or something like that, but it's always going to increase. So, Mr. Mark Zimmerman, no comments on that. Now, what can you say? What have you even come on here?
The whole reason I'm here is because we put out a video. By the time this comes out yesterday, we're recording it today when the video is coming out a little bit later, but talking about just the spring split in retrospect from the perception of sentiment and viewership. So if people haven't seen that video, check it out. The TLDR is that this is the first time since COVID 2020 summer bump when a lot of regions went up that we have had year-over-year growth in viewership. It's the largest split over split, so compared to previously summer. It's the largest in both raw AMA growth as well as percentage growth that we've had. since the franchise era, at least when we started tracking data a certain way. We talk about in that video how we do main broadcast versus full and just regular AMA, what that distinction is, where you're lopping off the pre and post show and why you might do that when there's more overlap, or you sped up the amount of game time you have. There's a lot of information in that video, so I think it's a good watch for people. Talk about some of the bets we made about being live at the right time versus the right place, and then we talk about peaks being down for the finals a little bit.
So what you're telling me is you're only going to come on the dive when you need something, and you're trying to shill your own other content.
This is a platform for information dissemination. That's what we use. That's what I'm going to use you guys for.
We're just getting used
I don't know what that
now.
word means, but how much
Information or dissemination?
I think you.
dissemination? I don't know. Like that sounds kind of dirty. How much of this do you think has to do with our new commissioner?
Oh God, dude, it's not dirty, and I don't think it has a ton. I think it's just been a fun, like you said, it was a fun split yourself, and I think that was a sentiment echoed by pretty much everyone. Like, we're obviously more than happy to take clips from like people as they say things in places, and so we saw a lot of that where it just said like this is one of the best splits in recent memory for a lot of people, and I think part of that is changes and whatever. But I think the pro players did like an incredible job, especially towards the end of the split. Like, we kind of just stuck microphones in front of them or took all chat and highlighted what they were doing. And I think that was really cool and helped people a lot. So I think a lot of it was just like general other things as well happening in the scene.
Yeah, it was kind of rough because last year really did feel like we were kind of hitting rock bottom with so many crazy things. It felt like going wrong and impacting viewership negatively. And we even had the walkout. And
True.
So many discussions with players and with fans, and at the time too, we had felt like for broadcasts, we were already making some really positive changes for our content direction and some of the direction that we wanted for the shape of the broadcast. But then we would always have some other like random rock falling on us every other week that we would have to deal with. This is back when you were still talent, still on the team. And so you very much, felt that and related to it. So while last year's summer was no surprise, like that was the lowest viewership that we've ever had. So that can like then lead to big improvements maybe the next year. Those things are not guaranteed, because I was worried, especially when you do like time changes, day changes for broadcast, sometimes people just, their lives change, and then it's not guaranteed for us to like recover big losses, no matter how like unexpected or kind of like, out of the blue some of the hits were. So I'm happy that we have done a lot of recovering here.
Yeah, I think there's obviously, when you start really low, there's a lot of ground to gain, and that can come, but it does still, you're like, how many of those people are gone forever and not just like they tuned out for that split. And so it is scary when you're setting record lows to not have like a bounce back. So to have a record bounce back, it felt really good. And I think, when I was watching all the other regional finals, one of the things I talked about in the video is like we lost CLG and TSM last year, and I think, we have new partners and teams that we're happy about and excited to work with. But, for the average fan who might have been watching for a long time, this is like some of your history gone. I'm watching T1 versus GenG finals and G2 versus Fnatic finals, and like LCS is reestablishing its identity. And so we don't have some of those like old storylines to fall back on, which is just like guaranteed to generate hype for your region. So I think there's still more work to be done in the future as we reestablish like what our identity is. But like for a first split, I'm very happy.
Now we've got APA trash talk.
I do have one question though. The criticism that needs to be brought up is that 2-week break.
We talk about it, in that video. So
that was like, I don't know. A lot of the sentiment I heard and felt myself was just like, why? Like, what is that? It's like everything else was so good, and there's like this huge gap.
Yes. So with only having 8 teams in our league, and you're doing double round robin best of 1 is kind of the standard of what the LCS has been forever, basically. It's
not ever.
It's gone up and down. Whether it's triple round robin or we had or what
or 4 in the beginning.
Yeah. Oh yeah, those Super Weeks 28 games was absolutely awesome, dude. Everyone loved those. Anyways,
it's fun.
Long story short, there's more around that topic in there and about the 4 reasons and what the bets we were making and all that stuff was. So I would highly encourage people to check it out. And I think the reasoning is in there. I stand by it. I think it was the right call when you compare all the other options available. And I think, we'll always listen to fans. We don't dodge that sort of sentiment. Like, we're not trying we always want to be transparent. So if people have questions, go watch that video.
What 2-week break?
Yeah, what are you talking about? No.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'll watch the video. Fine. Fine, you got me.
+1 viewer. That's how we do it here.
That's
So desperate for views.
That's how you get the clicks, baby. All the answers are in Mark's video. Tell all, reveal all. Yeah, I mean, I know for sure, especially while a lot of the other stuff going on, that it's a tough situation. But we're getting waved out right now.
They're playing us off.
So let's get right into it. For you at home who's watching right now, jam-packed episode. We're going to have correspondents from all the other major regions coming on. First one is going to be from LCK caster Ox coming up right after this. Then we're going to have Emily for LPL and Drakos for LEC. And Mark is gone forever. Azael's going to come back in. And you can go watch this video if you want. But here is the rest of the dive. We are going to welcome our LCK correspondent, Ox.
Hey.
Thank you for joining us, Ox. Thank you for calling in late, staying up for us. We're on early time. You're on late time. Perfect crossover.
Yeah, no, happy to be here. Obviously, I think I'm faring a bit better because it's like midnight here, but it's like 8 a.m. for you. So, yeah, definitely feeling better about
like
that time
morning
zone.
for you for gamer hours, Like,
yeah, this is
midnight is perfect.
I woke up like 3 hours ago. That's why.
That's a good
Just about to
schedule.
grind some solo queue.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So we're gonna have you talk a little bit about the teams. We're gonna start with T1, second seed from the LCK. Talk us through, their split, this team a little bit, as though you haven't watched a single game since Worlds last year. Because I think there's going to be a lot of LCS viewers who probably maybe watched LCK finals, hadn't watched a lot of the LCK regular season, but obviously last time they saw them, they were winning the title.
Yeah, I feel like, going into spring, you have this mindset that, okay, they just won Worlds, they're keeping the same roster, the expectation is like they're going to be on top, but the thing is, GenG has always been so good domestically, and we kind of had GenG and then GenG Light, which was Honor Life Esports, because we had Delight, we had Peanut, and we had Doran go over there. And so it felt like during the regular season, like T1 finished second, but there were definitely times they struggled against Honor Life Esports, and that kind of carried through in the playoffs as well. In their first matchup against Honor Life Esports, they actually got 3-0'd. So I feel like if your mindset is, okay, they're world champions, of course things are going to go well, it kind of didn't really play out that way. I think there's definitely like, with the LCK, you always have like the top end teams. There's quite a big gap before the lower end teams. So I don't think there's any doubt that they're going to make playoffs. But it's kind of those big matchups, like going up against GenG, going up against Honor Life in the second half of the season. Both of them looked kind of rough. And I think a big aspect of it was T1, a lot of the time they try and play heavily through bottom top. Those are their strong lanes. And it felt like both Honor Life and GenG were just kind of able to mitigate that quite a bit in the early matchups. And even the matchup against Honor Life Esports in playoffs, it felt like, Viper and Delight were just such a good duo that Guma and Keria couldn't really get too much of a lead. I'd say the other thing is something that really stood out to me at last Worlds was they kind of said in an interview to T1 that they'd like reevaluated their drafts, like some of their picks. It was kind of that period where like everyone was playing like engage picks and Renata was the best pick into them. And then T1 were like, hey, we can just play like Ashe and stuff and it works really well. It kind of felt like there was a similar sort of situation, not so much the sort of reevaluating, but there was a point where I was like, they really need to do that because I feel like sometimes their draft priorities, it's like the individual picks made sense, but you look at the comp together and you're just like, I'm not sure what you're cooking, but I kind of don't follow it. So, you'd think it'd be smooth sailing this season. I think it's kind of been anything but for T1, especially with the expectations that were on them from just winning Worlds and keeping the roster together.
Were you surprised at all that Keria wasn't cooking as much as a support? Because I felt like when you look around the world, we had, some Rumble supports and we had lots of AD supports and we had Camille support and Ornn support. And like, I know he played a lot of different champions, but mostly he was playing Nami, Tahm Kench, Nautilus. And I'm kind of curious, like, what your take is on that. Because I always feel like when the meta is crazy for supports, Keria is the best player in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like that there is definite instances where he played like the more creative picks. Like he had a Callisto support game where he had like 7 kills or something, and it was like he was stealing all the kills from Guma, which is kind of funny. But I feel like we've kind of seen at times they've even struggled. Like their series against Honor Esports, they gave Nautilus over to Delight 3 games in a row, and he just completely 1v9'd on it.
Then he cooked him.
And even like later on in the playoffs, there was some matches where you sort of saw Keria leaning more on these like traditional engage supports like the Nautilus, like the Rakan. And it's not like he's always been fine at those picks. It's like it's not like he's bad at them. It's just like, as you said, like his strength has really been those more like creative, like carry-oriented picks. But it kind of feels like sometimes it's like, well, Nautilus is just so strong. We could kind of just do with having a Nautilus. So I feel like the team have kind of struggled a bit with their identity in that way, because obviously that was one of the aspects that really gave them a big advantage at Worlds. It's one of the aspects that have given them an advantage when they had that spring run where they were just undefeated. But I think it's like, as the meta shifts, they kind of have to think, okay, well, yes, Keria can do this, but what do we need? Like, do we need to have a Nautilus on a composition? I do think like the thing with like the Tom Kench is interesting, because a lot of games they had where they played Senna plus X, they won so hard. And you still kind of saw that element of Keria, because even though he was playing Tom, he was kind of playing Tom as like super aggressive. Like, I have gold now, I'm going to kill. Like, I'm pretty sure he was like solo killing enemy AD carries and stuff. Like, they'd have Guma roam topside, and then it'd be 1v1 Keria against like, an AD carry, and you'd get like a solo kill, which is very funny, but doesn't really happen as much against like the top teams. But that definitely felt like there was like a huge win streak for T1 on Senna. And it definitely felt more like it was about Keria having gold than necessarily Guma on the Senna being like super impactful. It kind of just felt like, in general, Keria with gold is pretty good, which is also why when they kind of nerfed the gold generation for supports, and they nerfed like we came in this season, and I was like, man, this is going to be a great season for Keria, because they brought out all the new support items, all of them were like broken, and then they really nerfed those down quite a bit. And like the fact that you only get 800 gold when you complete them and stuff like that, I think those definitely kind of made them reconsider like what is the best angle for Keria, even though he still will play those things like the Rumble, and obviously it's still a strong pick for a lot of players.
There's a couple of questions that I had for T1 that kind of came up towards the end of the season, because like you're saying, at the beginning of the season, I was one of the people that was also super excited. Like, oh my God, they re-signed everyone from a world championship winning team, and it's T1. Like, this is going to be amazing. And then there were a couple of funny questions that popped up. Like, Zeus ended up having the most isolated deaths for anybody for the league. And then they also had, which is a bit less of a laughing matter, it turned into more drama, but was the DDoSing after their 0-3 to Hanwha Life. A couple of questions on that. First, for the Zeus one, kind of explain, because some people were, and you can never really tell if these people are fully memeing. They're like, oh yeah, it's a lot of good deaths, and then there's a lot of people that are like, come on, you're trolling. These are not good deaths. Like, he's dying for no reason a lot of these times. And then on the DDoS one, did you actually notice, like, around this timeline, a significant drop in their laning mechanics or anything that you would kind of actually say, hey, you might attribute this to having a more difficult time practicing?
I'd say for the Zeus point, it definitely felt like for a lot of the season, like he was picking Aatrox so often during the regular season, and like a lot of games, kind of a lot of the attention for the enemy team would go towards top lane. There was definitely some deaths where it's like, okay, Zeus, you really shouldn't have died there. But there was definitely some where it's like, they're playing through bot lane and Zeus is kind of left on an island. I think the amount of times you saw very specifically Zeus on Aatrox, he goes 0-2, and then he ends up just like completely carrying the game, because he finishes Profane Hydra, and then he like dashes on the enemy AD carry, doesn't even hit a Q or anything. He just like auto Hydra one-shots them. I'm like, cool. Like, that happened plenty of times throughout the season. So I think, like, even though he had a lot of isolated deaths, I think it was more so the fact that enemy teams were looking to target him, and T1 wasn't really playing around him as much. It kind of felt like leave him to his own devices and he's completely fine. But yeah, it's like definitely a mix of both. Like, there was definitely some deaths during the regular season where it just felt like he was being a bit greedy, but he still managed to be really impactful despite being put behind. I think there was definitely a point where they started to move away from Aatrox a bit. And I think that's because when he started playing things like TF was a really popular pick for him. That one you can't really get away with as much. If you die on TF, then things can quickly start to go pretty bad. So definitely changed then. And I'd say for the DDoSing point, it's like I don't know the exact time frame, but it definitely felt like towards the later on the split, they started to struggle more. Like again, a lot of the time T1 against like a lower seed team in the regular season, they're just gonna roll them. But against like the stronger teams, like it was on the back end where they lost to both On Life Esports and GenG. I will say that to me, the thing that stood out more than anything wasn't so much like individual laning mechanics. It kind of felt like the compositions they were putting together, like it felt like they were kind of behind on how the meta had shifted. It felt like they were playing these compositions in like Smolder, where I'm like, like they had that series against Nongshim that they very nearly lost because they kind of drafted a comp where like it was like ideal for the enemy Smolder, and then they kind of butchered a couple of plays, and the Smolder nearly 1v9'd it, and they managed to bring it back in the end. But it was like super close, and Nongshim are like a bottom end team. So I think as a whole, the team looked out of sorts, but I don't think I spotted anything. Like maybe I went back and looked retroactively, but like, this person was kind of underperforming a bit. But I think it was more so just like their team identity had kind of been shaken a bit, which makes sense if you're not able to practice and you're not able to keep up. Because especially we had like quite a few rapid like patch cycles, because we had the Lunar New Year break, and then we had 1 week of a patch, and then we switched to another. So I think maybe that could have had an impact, but ultimately, like, it's hard to say how much was actually down to the lack of practice. We can never really know. It's definitely something that came into account. And I think at the end of the day, like Honor Life Esports were like I think maybe if they'd lost to like an even lower end team, or if like let's say they'd been in like a lower round and they'd lost to like, I don't know, like Kwandong Freaks, I'm like, whoa, okay, something's afoot here. And sure, like losing 3 out of Honor Life Esports rough, but like Honor Life Esports were a good team. And if you think of the roster, like 3 of the players were on GenG last season, and they were, rolling T1. And then they had Zeka and Viper, who are also good players. So I don't know. I think it definitely had an effect, but I still think it's like as they kind of said afterwards, when Faker kind of apologized for it, it's like, it's frustrating, but there was more to it than just the lack of practice,
One thing I've always thought was interesting about T1 is their drafts. Because to me, their drafts always look so bad from a team comp perspective, but they make it work. They'll have these no frontline, no EC, but then they pull it off. Like, how do they do it?
Yeah, honestly, the thing is, it's like, this is why it's kind of difficult sometimes to evaluate T1's drafts, because like I'll look at some of their drafts, I'm like, man, this stinks. And like, if they're playing well, it like ends up working, and I kind of look stupid. If they're not playing well, then it looks terrible. And I'm like, I knew the draft sucked, but I think ultimately, like, this is something.
Vayne top.
I mean, yeah, like even there was one of the Vayne top games. Like there was the one against Honor Life Esports where I won, but there was like an earlier one where like I was convinced that like D+ had like a much better draft, and like I didn't think the Vayne was gonna be able to do that much because the enemy team had like Nautilus and Cassante and Veigar, and they ended up winning anyway. And I was like, okay, like they had like Senna Sejuani bot lane, and I was like, I wasn't sold on it at all, and they just kind of like outskilled our opponents. I think a big aspect of it is that like, Fake is obviously a very confident player, been around for a while, but like they're all confident at playing like these aggressive picks and like not having like a sort of more solidified front to back. I feel like GenG are much more of a team who are like, you look at them, expect them to have like a solid, this is a front to back composition, our front line are there, we provide peel, our back line is able to do what they do. Whereas T1, like it almost feels a bit more like the composition you'd expect in solo queue, where everyone's like more willing to be independent and like, I'm going to play my game in team fights, and it works in unison.
Plays and stuff.
Yeah, they look for the outplays, and even like in how they play like the macro game in general, or like how they set up for objectives, like they will. I think they're a scary team, even if they're behind, because they'll just go for what almost seems like very risky. I mean, the Baron one is a big one, right? Everyone's talked about T1 Barons all the time. We've seen it like flop, and it's kind of similar to team comps where like when it flops, everyone's like, man, what do they do? Why are they starting Baron like this? It's so troll. And then when it works, you're like, holy shit, they're absolute geniuses.
They've been like that for years, though, I feel like.
Yeah.
They've always had this crazy Baron and Herald stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of sort of a lot of that you see reflected in the drafts, a lot of that you see in the individual play, and a lot of that in the objective setup. And I think it's just the style of this team, which is very different to like, a lot of people are stuck in this, like, at least in the past, there was this like view of Keria where it was like, okay, it's very methodical, very slow paced. LPL is like the crazy hype, we make aggressive plays region. But I feel like T1, since the inception of this roster, has very much been like less standardized, controlled gameplay, which is more what I attribute to GenG. And T1 have had this sort of chaotic energy that just kind of works for them. And I think sometimes it really... Like, I know I said sometimes they'll have like a bad draft. I'm like, I don't see how this works. But there's been like big examples where it's backfired. Like everyone remembers the Jin Yumi, which is like forever immortalized as a moment where it's like, what were you actually thinking?
So they've obviously finished second in the LCK 4 times in a row now, but they did just win the World Championship. So what are the expectations? Because I think that after they won the World Championship, people were somewhat thinking, all right, if they stay together, the floodgates are going to open. They're just going to dominate everything, win every international tournament. But then they go back to LCK, they get second again. Is the baseline for success winning MSI, or what are you kind of looking at for this team?
I feel like, having won Worlds already, like, I feel like you would have want to get as much, like, obviously you always want to win as much as possible, but I feel like at minimum, if you're staying together as this roster, like winning Worlds a second time in a row is really hard to do, but you'd want to win MSI, There's less teams going to the tournament who obviously, it means it's like a higher chance of winning, especially when chances are it's obviously not impossible for it to be other regions, but chances are it's going to be an LCK or LPL team. I feel like if you're sticking together as a Worlds winning roster, like winning MSI kind of feels like the bare minimum for like your expectations. And also just like you'd want to take 2, and you'd think Spring would have been the one with them sticking together with a Worlds winning roster, but like you at least want 1 title from GenG, because it's kind of getting a little bit ridiculous. This one was really close, to be fair, but if you stick together and you don't win MSI and GenG beat you both times, like Spring and Summer, and then like, let's say you don't win Worlds, it's kind of like, why do we even stick together, at that point? Obviously, it's hype for the fans, and the fans like love that they stay together, but you really want to be like racking up some more wins, and especially as like they've been close so many times winning these internationals, and you really just want to get an MSI under the
Game
belt.
5 2022 Worlds finals, Game 5 MSI 2022 finals.
Yeah,
So they've been really close. It's interesting though, because their domestic success hasn't always stop them when they go international, right? Like, or lack thereof, because they always seem to lose GenG and then do better. But we should talk about GenG. Obviously, they are the number 1 seed. Some big changes for them this year. There is, I think, this kind of stigma about Chovy where people are like, he's a choker. He's not going to get it done international. GenG, you're not going to be able to get it done international. What is your take on this? Because the team changed a lot, right? And so for people who haven't actually watched them since last year, talk us through, what GenG 2024 looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think GenG 2024 has looked like during the regular season looked super convincing. I think Canyon and Chovy together looked like such a strong mid jungle. It kind of just looked a bit unfair, and I'm sure everyone's seen that. Like, people talk a lot about the LCK All Pro. There's definitely some disagreements on like the Korean and global side as to like what should have been the first All Pro. But like the thing that was kind of unanimous was like Chovy getting like all the MVP votes, and then Chovy also won all the player of the game votes, and he kind of just looked like on another level to everyone. I think a lot of people who've watched LCK have said like he's just like best player in the world right now, which I'm always like a little bit, how can you say that before internationals? But even I'm kind of admitting like he has just been on like a complete other form. He has really just been 1v9ing. I think Canyon's been like a really solid addition, although to be honest, like we have seen moments, but for the most part, Canyon's just kind of been chilling on tank duty, and that's just been enough. But like, I think a lot of expectations with this roster was like with Chovy playing really well. I think Peanut is someone who's been part of like struggling in internationals at times to replicate. I mean, within recent history. So people were wondering like, okay, Peanut's chased out for Canyon. Canyon's typically good at internationals. Like maybe this is like the roster that has like, this is going to be the GenG that like replicates those performances when they go to like MSI or Worlds. But I feel like playoffs was kind of like, even though they won, I feel like they looked a lot more untouchable in the regular season. And even, I think the big one for me was like the Hun Life series, which is obviously against a lot of the players from their former roster, because it was Delight, Doran, and Peanut going up against them. But like, if anyone hasn't caught that roster, caught that match, that series, it was so insane, like how much better Hun Life Esports looked overall. It was like a 3-1 for GenG, and yet like, I think that if it wasn't for Chovy, like completely 1v9ing, it would have just been like a 3-0 for Hun Life Esports, because Pays looked really rough. Pays and Lehends in general, the laning phases looked a bit weak. Canyon didn't massively show up. And then it kind of felt like Hun Life Esports were outperforming, and then it just got to the team fights, and Chovy would just kill everyone, or like he'd like get a shuffle on a Viper, or like there was this one game where he was playing Azir, and it was like in football when you like mark a player. It was like he was just marking Viper the whole time. And he would just constantly be threatening him. And anytime Viper like walked up or tried to actually play the team fight, he would just get dashed on by Chovy. And like sometimes Chovy would like shuffle him. Sometimes he'd sit there and wait for him to like get Tom Ken cheating, or like wait for him to like flash or something, and it just felt like he was kind of bullying the whole time. It was it was really something. But that it is one of those series, where like the team wins, but it gives you more concerns about them. And I was kind of thinking, like, if Chovy doesn't, like, if we go to MSI and Chovy isn't playing at that level, I'm legitimately kind of concerned for GenG, especially since like Pays continued to look rough in the finals.
Pays definitely seemed like he was struggling. Well, their bot lane seemed like they were struggling in a number of the series.
Yeah, and I think I haven't watched a ton of the LPL because obviously a lot of the time it's the same time as the LCK. But like Elkanon look insane. Jackal and Mako is obviously a really strong duo. So I'm like really concerned for GenG's bot lane going up against those like really strong 2v2s, because I think like a big reason why they manage it against T1, like sometimes they do manage to neutralize, but a big reason they manage it is because they just have so much pressure from like Chovy and Canyon, Chovy in particular. But I feel like especially if you look at BLG, like BLG have Knight. I think Knight's a good match for Chovy.
Yeah.
And then they also have like Bin in the top lane. It just feels like that is really where the weaknesses of the bot 2v2, I think, are going to be exposed. And
if your solos aren't blowing them out, then your bot lane could be a problem.
Yeah, I think that's definitely how I view it.
Do you think that GenG is going to do better than T1 at MSI? Because traditionally, I don't know, their more controlled play style seems to not do as well against like Chinese teams and whatnot.
Yeah, I probably think they won't do as well. Just obviously, historically, they haven't performed as well at internationals. T1's done better, but also like when I look at the matchups, like to me, GenG is the lineup where like I don't see any real chance of them getting upset by like a weaker team. Like I think it's so hard for a team to match up into them who don't have like players of the same caliber, just because you're gonna end up so far behind a farm. Like one of the ways that GenG play is basically like they just get more resources from you, and we even saw like that like game one of the finals. It really felt like there was like this point where they did like this 3-lane swap, and they ended up like going top because the wave was bouncing, so they ended up killing Zeus, and they swapped Chovy down bot so we could catch the wave because they was Kiin on Rumble and he wouldn't be able to pick up the farm. And then Kiin ended up going mid and picking up that wave. Like I feel like their map movements are really smart, and they end up just like it's always been a thing with Chovy. We'll just end up with more farm, but like it feels like as a whole the team just ends up with more gold. It's kind of like back in the day, like the Korean teams, you'd see them like fall behind in kills. Like maybe the enemy team would have 10 kills, but you'd look at the gold and the gold would still be even, and then they just win one fight and it's like boom, it's done. And it feels like it's not even with like the kill deficit, but just like they just end up getting more resources, which is why I think like weaker teams really struggle against them. But I think like I think they are definitely in a better position when they're ahead in the game and they have control of the pace. But I think like the games where you see T1 win against them are ones where like it kind of feels like T1 pulled it out of the bag, but it just feels like, if the game is slow paced and they're not really challenged, GenG will just choke you out. But it feels like T1 have that explosive element, and it has obviously matched it badly into them. But I think like BLG bring that level, but they also have like the strong solo laners. I think it could be a problem. And I think like over the course of a tournament, T1 tend to like adjust well and ramp up, whereas like GenG have historically like struggled in the later stages. I think T1 have kind of been sharp, and there's been like meta adaptations in a long tournament. And like if you look at like a lot of the games that GenG play, it's like they'll have a tank top. A lot of the games was like Rek'Sai or Cassante for Kiin. Canyon's been playing a lot of tank junglers. They kind of have like a scaling pick for Chovy. It's been a lot of Corki, a lot of Azir, a lot of Aurelion Sol, and then like an AD carry obviously scales well. And it kind of feels like, not saying that like they're like limited in terms of scope, but it kind of feels like they know what works for them and they've just been playing that. Whereas, and I think that can sometimes be something that hurts them. Like I think T1, even if they struggle in a game, you're always like thinking, oh, they can pull out of the bag. Or even if they're like the meta's not amazing for them, they can kind of just, bring out these compositions that don't really seem like they're that tied to the meta, but kind of end up working and maybe reshaping the meta. But I think like GenG aren't as creative in that aspect, which I think hurts a lot when you're at an international and you're stuck on one patch for like an extended period.
Yeah, I've heard criticism that GenG's good at playing against teams that they've seen a lot. Like, they know all their tricks, but when they're faced with something new, they don't always, like you said, adapt as fast.
Yeah, I definitely feel like it kind of looks that way, especially when like they've consistently had T1's number. But even then, like this finals was so close, like it really came down on the wire. And it does make me kind of wonder, like, because previously we had GenG underperforming when they went to internationals, but that was when like this is the first 3-2 finals we've had in the LCK since like 2018.
Forever.
So
yeah,
it's kind of been like GenG, because obviously GenG won, but like GenG have been super dominant domestically a lot of the time, and then gone to internationals and underperformed, and like it wasn't as convincing this time, and it kind of makes you wonder like, are they going to reflect more on that and then hopefully like come back from it? But then again, like one of the criticisms has been maybe they don't like reflect as well as T1 does, so maybe they're just like relatively not as strong as they have been previously, which could make it look even worse at internationals, especially when you think like last MSI.
Oh no.
Yeah, like last MSI they were the 4th best team, and there was like 2 LCK and 2 LPL teams. Like they were the worst performing of the LCK and the LPL, and I'm thinking like, could it be worse? That's kind of my concern.
How does GenG do with carry tops? Because I know that Zeus does really well, and the meta for LCK finals was, like Zac, Rek'Sai, Cassante top, and I think MSI patch, a lot of those have been nerfed.
Yeah.
Especially like Rek'Sai and Zac, I believe, as well. So maybe we'll see more carry tops. Do you think GenG will do well in that meta?
I don't think they will benefit from it as much as the other teams. I think they're fine playing carry tops.
Bin.
Yeah, like I look at like Bin, 369, and Zeus, and I think they're all going to benefit from it more, especially 369, like who, last year was very much like on tank duty, now has been very much on the carry duty. It kind of feels like Kiin is in the like last year 369 arc where he has played carries, don't get me wrong, but like in the finals it was kind of just like Rek'Sai, Cassante, and he did have a Rumble game, but it was more so him being on those. So like he definitely can play the carries. It's more so for GenG, as I said, they kind of had their style that they lean into, and that's worked for them. And I think if you're looking at a carry player, like he's 4th on the list compared to the other 3. So yeah, I think it's a bit concerning. I think that's my worries. I think like Chovy's never like, that's the thing is, even though people talk about like Chovy not performing as well, I think part of it is like the team as a whole doesn't perform as well. And Chovy, when the game's going bad, tends to kind of just like play his own game and farm up, because there's not much else you can do. But I think Chovy's been in such good form. I'm not really worried about him. It's like everything else that I'm kind of a bit like.
I think the thing that most people are worried about for GenG, because when I was prepping the LCK VODs, I was getting pretty hyped, and then I started prepping the LPL VODs, and I was like, oh my god, Elk and On are gonna absolutely crap on FaZe and dive him early. They're doing their own 2v2 dives, they're doing 3v3 dives. I was like getting very worried. Do you think, because there's like two sides for the argument, because they're such different teams, if you're looking at the number 1 seeds from LCK and LPL going against each other, if GenG have to go against BLG, do you think that they are going to be able to utilize the lane swaps and GenG's very good macro, or are they going to get overwhelmed, and is it going to be like Elk and On are turbo diving, and it's going to be a massive bot diff and Chovy can't carry?
I think it's hard to say. I mean, those are like the two sides of the coin. Like one will happen or the other. I'm kind of leaning BLG just because I think like part of it is a big reason why GenG can be afforded to like have so much space for the bot lane is like in a game where, as I said before, like if Chovy has so much pressure, if top lane's doing well, if Canyon's able to have free reign and it's like build up a farm lead, then any pressure towards bot is kind of mitigated. But I think like BLG are so strong across the board, it's going to be problematic. And also we kind of saw like MSI last year, even though it was a different BLG where they didn't have Knight, like Shun was just like focused towards bot, and it felt like this worked. Like you'd hope they learned from it, but like watching both GenG and T1 kind of fall prey to these like level 3, level 4 like bot dives from Shun, and it just worked like again and again and again and again. And I feel like it's something that BLG has been praised for, like their ability to like dive and set a pressure bot as a 3-man unit. But I'm not convinced they have like a solution to be able to combat them. I think like always people are going to talk about like the first place LCK team, first place LPL team, like who's better. I think it's like not even just like about like who's the better team. I think like stylistically, I'm like really concerned for GenG in that 1v1 matchup. Like it might end up being a situation where like, if GenG played against T1, GenG would win. But if T1 played against BLG, that's like the better chance for the LCK. And if BLG played against GenG, then they'd win. Like I think a lot of people always think like, especially we've had tier lists recently, like, okay, this is a tier list. This team's the best. They beat all the teams below them. And then all the teams below them beat all the teams below, that sort of thing. But I think like it might come more down to like how they match up into each other. And I think just the the rough time that Pays and Lehends have been having in lane, really BLG are like the worst opponent for them to go up against. Yeah, so I'm kind of concerned.
So I have. It sounds like you're very concerned. You sound stressed. So I have one more question for you. Obviously, I think people are going to be very familiar with Canyon if they've watched a lot of international. Kiin, obviously, people may not have that same level of familiarity. You touched on the change between Peanut and Canyon, but they also did change, Doran for Kiin. They changed Delight for Lehends. Talk a little bit about, those two players and kind of like maybe what they bring that's different to the team, than their predecessors.
So I think for Kiin, I think Doran had like a big clutch factor when it came to like domestic finals, and especially like he had this tendency just to bop Zeus, which was kind of funny constantly. But
He's his father.
He's his father. But Kiin, I feel like in a lot of people's mind, Kiin has always been this like really strong individual performer who's like never quite made it. I mean, this was his first season win, and we had like a graphic. He's placed every single spot in the LCK. He's been like 10th to 1st now. He's finished everywhere.
I saw that. It was insane.
So, but like throughout that, people have always been like,
so now he's got to restart and go 10th again.
That's the goal.
Right?
That's what you got to do.
Was it all in order?
I feel like a lot of people have much higher like impression of him. Like Doran would always have this tendency just to kind of like sometimes just do these Doran plays where he'd get solo killed for no reason, but then come back in team fights. I feel like Kiin's been really solid in team fights, but also pretty formidable laner. As I said, the team kind of put him on tank duty a lot, but it felt like even so, like he still had a lot of individual performances. Like earlier in the split, he was playing stuff like the Renekton, like the Jace, and was pretty solid. So I think it's definitely a more robust.
And he solo killed Zeus multiple times too.
Yeah. I mean,
he was solo killing and then good in team fights.
People have actually, I don't like talking about it too much, but we even had a chucking incident with Zeus because he like super underperformed in finals. Like, I mean, I think he wasn't like that terrible, but like his scoreline was awful, and they're like, yeah. There was like jokes about, Kiin is now Zeus' father, all sorts of things. So, I mean, Kiin's looked really good, and I think it's made the like top side really strong. Canyon as well, like I think he's been a really solid addition, but I don't think he's doing things that crazily different to like what Peanut would have done, other than like these few exceptional games. For a lot of the time, they're like putting him on these tanks, especially in the regular season.
And stuff.
But yeah, like the Kazakhs game was like a really big standout. Like that one was such a clutch one because they were like down in the series, and I just felt like he completely controlled the pace of the game, and it was kind of reminiscent of like the Canyon we've seen in the past. And even if we have like a quiet game from him, you still see he's like got a very good mind for like where he needs to be on the map and like his pathing. And like, if the enemy jungle is like a little bit uncertain with their movements or like spend a bit too much time in a spot, it just feels like he builds up such a natural advantage over them, which kind of fits in well with the rest of the roster. But I know like D+ definitely struggled for a while because they were lacking like a really vocal shot caller after Beryl left. And I think a big reason when Peanut left and they got Canyon that they wanted to bring Lehends back was because Lehends is very vocal, and obviously Peanut is as well, but they wanted to fill that void. So, I'd be pretty critical of Lehends and his individual play, but definitely a lot of people, especially on the Creme side, value him a lot for like his voice in the team and credit a lot of the like macro moves and success there to him. So there's definitely benefit to have him in on the roster because I think a lot of people, if you look at just like the individual play, they'll probably be like, they could have just had the light. But I think that's the specific reason why they made those moves to make sure they had someone who was that voice in the team.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ox. I really appreciate you taking out the time.
Nice.
And it will look forward to seeing some more LCK casting from you next split.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ox.
Thank you.
All right, welcome to our LEC correspondent, Daniel Drakos, LEC caster, if you don't know. He is actually an American that we embedded in Europe many years ago for this point.
To activate at this moment.
To deliver us the secret intel on the European teams for MSI so that we may destroy them.
Look, man, all I'm saying is I've been waiting for you to activate me, but you keep forgetting the code phrase. You got like rutabaga, foxtrot, frisky, and then you forget like the next 8
banana.
words. So I'm not sure if I'm actually supposed to activate or not. You really gotta remember whatever it is you wrote down when you like implanted the messages in my brain.
We threw away the passcode.
So Drakos, just speaking hypothetically, if I were a team, with say Core JJ and Impact and APA and Yon and just people like that, and I were to be playing against some European teams, how would I go about beating them?
Well, that's the beautiful thing, Isaac, is that if you're playing against G2, as you may have noticed in the finals, they'll beat themselves. They'll be like, damn, where do we have the biggest role discrepancy? Top lane versus Oscar? let's give him a 2v1 matchup. Let him just sit under his tower. We'll let Broken Blade eat dives. No, I don't know, man. I don't know what
Oscar
TL
was
do.
looking
I got a lot
dizzy
of,
in a couple of those lane swap games.
I think most of the lane swap games were iffy. I was very caught off guard. For those of you who missed it, obviously LEC finals a lot of lane swap games, and I was caught off guard by the sheer quantity of times that G2 went for the lane swap. At first, it was like, oh, cool, they're lane swapping, and then they did it like most of their games, even when it didn't necessarily make sense outside of the way that they were drafting, where they were telling you straight up in the first 3 picks that they were going to lane swap. So I'm skeptical, but I will say that if you want, beating G2 will be a tough task, but G2 have that frustrating level of plot armor, I think that has made them difficult to talk about for a long time, which is basically just like they always win. So kind of even if there are hiccups in their game, right? Like right now, their early game looks suspect. A lot of these lane swaps were questionable. They're still winning. Caps is still Caps, and it makes it hard to throw like greater long-standing criticism at them past like, hey, your guys' early game needs to shape up, because there's this kind of underlying belief, I think, for a lot of European fans and myself as a European pundit that like, oh, don't worry, come MSI, you know, they're going to be, oh, their early game's going to be good again, and all this stuff they've been working on in the mid game is really going to have added, and they're going to be so much better. But I'm sweating a little bit for G2. I'm not going to lie.
So I'm kind of curious, like, what's your take? So obviously it's Fnatic, it's G2 that are going to be going to MSI. You know, no big strangers to international performances for those teams. But you know, if you're an LCS fan who say hasn't really watched LEC since Worlds, where the LEC was absolutely and utterly devastated, destroyed, and torn apart by NRG, you know, like
yes.
what are you kind of feeling? Because it's like I feel like there's been this overwhelming amount of negativity surrounding the LEC just throughout this split and kind of more recently. And we talked about this on the dive. You know, Medius was saying he thought it was really overblown. I kind of feel like it is as well. But, you know, once something starts trending in a direction, people start really kind of jumping on that bandwagon, you know, whether it's hate or whether it's positivity. And so right now it feels like, you know, the LEC international performance stocks are at an all-time low. I'm kind of curious, like, where do you sit on this? Do you just think this is super overblown? Are your expectations still as high as always for your teams when you go international? You know, kind of like how are you looking at it, you know, as far as how you're evaluating, you know, Fnatic, G2, their expectations?
Yeah, I definitely agree with the sentiment that I think that, like, there's an overwhelming, probably, like, too much negativity surrounding the region as a whole right now. I do think that the overall level like is a bit lower, but I also think that like as European fans we got really used to a certain very high level performance. We're still kind of holding on to that torch
and stuff.
Yeah, maybe when we like shouldn't be, and we should be reevaluating. And it's not that you shouldn't hold your teams to a high standard, but you should still celebrate the successes of your teams, which I think because the bar has been set so high, it's often people are measuring them, I think, in a way that makes it really hard for teams to feel successful domestically. And I think that goes for us on broadcast too. I think maybe we've been a little bit over eager with the criticism this split. But that said, I am incredibly optimistic for G2. I do have a lot of concerns kind of around their regular season and their playoffs, because despite the fact that they won, I do still think there are holes in their game, especially their early game, that weren't there last year. Now they have acknowledged those, and they've said that their focus has been on building this kind of unstoppable mid game, and that, you know, has worked. Their mid game has been good, has been much better than any other team in our league. But I think when they lose some of that flair that made them so successful in years past, you know, the doubt starts to creep in. If you're an NA fan looking at this team, I will say that like the biggest thing for MSI compared to last MSI is that like last MSI was one of the first times we ever saw Caps kind of in a slump, and a slump that the team kind of agreed was there, the whole community agreed was there. And I think this MSI is a very different story. I think Caps has been, I think, and he was also pretty much back in form at Worlds too, but I think at this MSI, the big difference from last year is that he's very much back in form. I think he is hands down the best mid laner in our league and is like carrying games individually and proving it pretty consistently. So he is still, like, if you're an NA fan, the player that I think you want to watch or is Caps versus like any NA mid laner is going to be just like a super, super exciting lane matchups. Like there's merit in talking about the other lanes for sure, but like he is ultimate. Like if Caps gets out of hand, like the game will fall apart very quickly.
He was insane in LEC this year, I thought.
Yeah. So that's the big thing for me is Caps.
Do you think G2 is doing the lane swap as a way to like get away from their weak early game, a way to like band-aid the early game? Because I heard you mention that, you know, it's kind of shaky. Or do you think they're doing it to try to catch teams off guard because they just, you know, won't react to it properly?
There's like a couple things. So I think that G2 I think that there is some concern that what you've said is correct, like that they are doing it to get away from a weak early game, especially when you look historically at like Hansama Mickey as a super dominant 2v2. You kind of look at the ways that you can break bot lane in any given meta, right? And there's like the Keria thing from last year where it's like maybe you just counterpick support and you take over a matchup. And I don't think Hansama and Mickey in this meta were ever going to pick like Caitlyn support, but that's kind of more the line I would have expected them to take if they wanted to get an edge bot lane. Instead, they took this lane swap thing from NIP in the LPL. And I think that at first it felt to me like they were cooking. Now I'm a little bit nervous. But one of the things that the team has said themselves is like, look, last year we got wins and looked good. And part of the reason that they were Scrim world champions or whatever, right, is because that like most of the way that they won games was like they blew open a game very early, usually through bot lane, like whether it was Draven picks or whatever, hyper aggressive plays. And something the team wanted to step away from this year was like over relying on that, because they felt like in hindsight, looking back at last year, like their mid game was atrocious. And part of the reason it was so bad was because the only reason that they were like, or the biggest way that they were winning games more often than not was just like generating massive leads early and then not really getting the experience and practice to play through mid games or even really to recognize their own weaknesses in mid games, which they felt like, you know, they brought in Duffman this year. They felt like they had this big mid game revelation. They're very big on him and that he solved a lot of their mid game problems and made them aware of a lot more of their mid game problems. But what I will say is it could also be the biggest cope of all time, right? So what we need to see now from G2 and the reason there are some nerves here.
Our performance internationally, we started inting in the early game, and this is really going to help us.
Yeah. So what's hilarious about this is this also happened to 2016, 2017 on like the OG G2 Dynasty Perks Sven Mithy roster, where they were like, practice is bad, or like, we're literally dominating teams too hard, so we're going to stop picking crazy strong lanes.
Wait, was this the vacation era?
Yes, this is what happened in the vacation. So this is why I'm nervous, is because I've heard these exact same words come out of Mithy's mouth about how practice is bad, games are ending too quickly, so we're going to focus on something else, which always seemed like a stretch. But what I will say is like, I am actually sold. I've talked to this team over a lot of years. I do believe that like they have worked very heavily on their mid game. And I do think that their early game has suffered as a result of it because it hasn't been where their focus has been. The question is like, can they turn it back on? Like, is the boot camp, is the time that they have between the end of LEC and MSI enough for them to like really amp up their early game? I don't know. But like, I think that's kind of the pitch that you have to believe if you do want G2 to go far in this tournament, which I think that they can.
Yeah, I would say at least one positive thing in watching, at least a lot of the playoffs is it does feel like the training weights that they're putting on themselves have worked for a lot of not the level 1 lane swaps, but I was really impressed with a lot of the plays past like 5 or 6 minutes. You know, the ones where it's like the 4th time they're swapping and then they leave Hansama plus Yike or something in the brush and then they catch you when you're trying to, correct your lane assignments. And these types of things where if they're forcing a lot of these lane swap games and yeah, they're kind of messy or whatever, but it gets them really thinking about purposeful movement for every minion wave. And I can really see that in a lot of kind of, like you're saying, the mid game, I guess, lane swap things that they're going for. So I think that it definitely can have that like training weight and positive impact if they're then able to correct and adjust to the meta that actually develops at Worlds and apply it there.
I felt like such a good example of that was I think it was game 2 of the finals against Fnatic. It was the Jinx Thresh game, and I'm pretty sure it was this one where Noah was playing Kalista and June was playing Nico.
Yeah.
And Fnatic drafts for this like super dominant bot lane, and so yeah, like they are basically anticipating that Hans and Mickey are going to lane swap away from them. So Hans and Mickey just hide their like lane assignments, go bot when Fnatic sends their bot lane top. Then as soon as they're basing to reset, then they base and they swap, and they dodge them like 3 or 4 times in a row. It felt like, just basically perfectly anticipating, when Noah and June would be moving on the map and where they would be. And it felt like they completely mitigated, Fnatic's early game that they were drafting for with these picks, by playing the map so well. And I think that is mostly, the biggest thing that has impressed me from G2, watching them throughout the regular season and through playoffs, is how they actually play the map I think, when they can open up the map, Caps really does feel like he has been unlocked. Like when he can be moving around the map, playing in side lanes, when they have prio, when they're actually, moving around, he can create plays, whether it's through side lanes or collapses or, finding flanks around objectives and stuff. I feel like that is kind of G2 at their best.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that it's easy to tunnel in the lane swaps because it's so much of what their like the tail end of their playoffs were and the most recent tape that we have. But I think that the mid game really showed itself a lot in the regular season. We ended up in these situations when we think back to like last year, MSI is another example where we had like Mad Lions would get like 4 kills against T1 and they'd be up 3k gold, and then T1 would just like never give them a good fight, beat them in every single circumstance, outtrade them on the map. Like that's kind of how G2 is feeling like for us domestically, is the T1 in that context, where it's like even if you get an early game lead, like they will always set their wave state up in such a way where they will punish you if you play on a bad wave. They will punish you if you overcommit to an objective. If you step one wave too far or stay one wave too long, they are so good and so consistent about doing that. And they're not a team that gets caught very frequently in setup in the same way that a lot of other LEC teams are. And so when we talk about like G2 being really good in the mid game, it's really just that they're much more aware of the opportunities that are available to them and much quicker to punish than any of the other teams in our league. And so you end up in these games where like if you're just watching it kind of casually, it just looks like the enemy team is just like giving so much free stuff to G2, but it's just the product of like them being so good and so diligent on when they take fights, when they reset, when they set their vision up. And it's not as flashy as it was last year, right? Because it's not as explosive, but it has been super, super dominant, even if in the early game, maybe they've been giving away a bit too much gold and been getting a little bit too sloppy on like whether it's disrespecting a jungler or misplaying in a 1v1. Stuff like that.
Can you tell me a little bit about Yike? Because I'm kind of on the late night sleep schedule, so I don't always catch LEC because it's kind of early for me. But I know that like he's got a really fun playstyle to watch. I know he plays like Belveth and Rek'Sai. So how is his like development as a player come this split since being on G2 for a bit longer?
Yeah, I think that Yike was in a really cool spot in winter, especially because I think in winter we got to see kind of him and Caps together as this like mid-jungle duo really take over the league. They were kind of ego picking. I don't want to say 100% ego picking, but they were picking like Ahri Lee Sin into Talia every time and just like trusting they would just outplay Talia in every single game that they got it. And it worked up until they played Fnatic, and Fnatic played like jammed Poppy Talia and just finally said like, we'll add one more wall and that'll be enough. And this time it like finally worked.
Build a wall.
This is a guy who I think like can be a role player and has definitely developed enough and has been surrounded by good players, and his like game sense and understanding is really good. But the fact that G2 have kind of let him flourish as a more carry focused jungler when it makes sense, I think is one of the most exciting things about him. While he will play like the Rels of the world when it's what the team requires, like his Viego is still something he'll fall back on. You talked about the Belveth, like Lilia last year was the big pick, right? And so this is a guy who in the right draft, in the right context, can totally take over a game. And even in this year on pick, like Lee Sin is probably the one that I remember the most from a couple of the Ahri games, right? But has done so on a couple other picks, like is a guy who will either funnel Caps or kind of build for himself. He had, I think, a Viego game that was pretty similarly good where he was much more the center of attention. But he's been very flexible and very versatile. The problem, I think, like for people who want to dig deeper into Yike is always that, like, unless you are a jungler and you really want to watch his pathing, right, is that a jungler on a team that's as good and as successful more often than not in lane as G2 is it's like it's kind of sometimes harder to put bigger criticism on him. But for me, as a non-jungle expert, I think it's safe to say, even if I would consider an overall League of Legends expert, I think that he's been super flexible, super versatile, and he's almost always where he needs to be and playing to the right side of the map, the right win condition. Like you can usually guess where Yike is going to play towards based on draft. He's consistently where he needs to be. And I think that like for me, he's solid, plus the flair of having these additional champion pools and being someone who can take on the carry mantle like when it's needed from the team.
So, talk about what success is for G2 at MSI, right? Obviously, everyone wants to win the tournament. Everyone, wants to be, getting that guaranteed world slot, so on and so forth. But like, what would you be happy with, as far as performance-wise from G2?
I think for me, God, a lot depends on tournament meta, like how high I expect them to go. But I think I want to see them beat an LCK or LPL team in a best of 5. Right now, that means praying that top esports, they find the top esports matchup and the top esports have a top esports day, which is like a little bit disingenuous because I'm just preying on the top esports downfall because I think that this is the easiest pickings of all of the prospective teams, right? But I think for G2 this is like a year-long project to be at an international caliber, and it's why they're willing to leverage this position of power that they have in our league where they can focus on one thing and spend an entire split focusing on that one thing, because like them making it to the next stage of each of our little mini splits, right, is such a guaranteed thing. So they're leveraging that unique position that they're in to be as focused and as prepared for international competition, which I respect. But I do think it's a year-long journey. And so for me, like at Worlds, I want to see like semis, right? But at MSI, I'll settle for a best of 5 win over, you know, an LCK or LPL representative. And I think that will be proof that this is short of like, yeah, they show up and like one team just chokes and it's very clear to everyone that this team just bombed. But if they play a good competitive series and they can win against an LCK or LPL team, that to me is like the first marker on, I think, a much longer journey towards Worlds for G2.
I think that's a good goal. Enough time talking about the golden child of Europe, though, G2. I think we need...
The redheaded stepchild.
We need to get into Fnatic.
Look,
I
man,
really want to hear you talk about Fnatic.
We're not a
because
one
these
team
games,
region.
We're
a one player region, Kobe, and that player
It's
is
Caps,
Caps. Wherever Caps goes, that team is the
12-1 in
golden
LEC
child.
finals, by the way. That's insane.
This man is the actual, at least the European GOAT. I'm still holding on to Western GOAT. Maybe we can have an episode where
He's
we
the
talk
Western
about
GOAT. He's the Western GOAT.
He definitely is now. I mean,
The only person I used to argue was Perks, but the Perks fall off has been pretty big compared to Caps is just still going at that top level.
Yeah, maybe
Yeah,
Impact just keeps going for another 20 years and just outlasts him, and we can put Impact in the discussion.
True. There you go.
but Fnatic has actually been so fun to watch as a North American viewer because the games are always bangers. They're literally full sending every single play, regardless if it is like an 80% play or like a 20% play. Every single time I'm like, oh hell yeah, here we go. You know, they're going in again. And I've seen people, especially now that we're approaching MSI, say, oh yeah, Fnatic is also going to dominate just like G2 as long as they calm down and they stop doing some of these overchase plays. But I'm like, are you kidding me? That would be a completely different team. If you're taking out some of these plays where they're over chasing and they, you know, lose 4 members, then you would also have to take out some of their full send plays where they snowball and they get so many advantages, you know, and Humanoid is popping off or Razork is popping off. So where do you stand on Fnatic and like their progression over this year?
Yeah, for me, it's like Fnatic have been, it's been nice to see them succeed as much as they had. I think it's been dangerously close to like, on Euphoria, Rob and I predicted Fnatic to make it, but then the fashion in which they made it to finals was like maybe not super convincing in a lot of circumstances, even though at the end of the day, like they still were able to put up great results. It was a little shaky there towards the end of the regular season in the first couple steps in playoffs. You know, the losses to G2 started to shed some doubt. Like the Team Heretic series was a little bit messy. But I would say that I agree with you that like their explosiveness, their confidence plays are a big part of who they are, and I think what has made them successful. And I think that the best version of the Fnatic is that super confident Fnatic. And like while maybe they did get overconfident, especially in that game 2 versus G2 in our finals, I don't think they would have made it as far without, like, I think that same overchase instinct is the thing that got them as far as it did, if we want to call it an overchase instinct, or if we just want to call it them playing aggressive or playing confident. Because I think this version of Fnatic have proven themselves, and based on like watching their content behind the scenes and kind of interviews with the players, to be a pretty like momentum, emotional team, right? Like when the vibe is good and the practice is good, they play better together, they play more decisively, but you can see it fall apart very quickly when things start to go wrong. And you can see it even game to game. Like sometimes, you know, in Razork's performance, especially in the jungle, like I think when he's confident and he's playing well and he has a champion that can do a lot, like the team can just take over. But when that's not the case, like he looks like a shadow of himself. And I think the same is true for most parts of Fnatic at this stage. So I am not as optimistic that they can do as well as G2, mostly because I think that like they're going to need more time to develop past to like temper their aggression, because right now the best version we've seen of them is really aggressive, build big leads early, you know, like set up Noah to carry, Jun, Razork, like tag teaming around the map, which is something we were waiting to see all season long and like kind of finally came together in the last few weeks. And I don't know what a tempered Fnatic looks like, but that feels like a down the road thing. I just want a confident Fnatic. Like if they make 5, if they're like, we're inting together and all 5 of them do it, I'll be happy, you know, like bam. Cause like maybe it goes bad, sure, but like that's better. Cause the Fnatic that makes split decisions looks terrible. And we've seen that Fnatic multiple times this season.
Are you worried about them then going into this? Because it sounds like, you know, if you're momentum based and you're playing against much stronger opponents than you have previously, that could be really hard for the morale. You know, when you start scrimming against those Korean, Chinese teams, you start losing every game. It feels like nothing you're doing is working. You think they'll be able to handle that or not?
I'm not sure. I think the thing that gives me hope is that like Humanoid is a mid laner who loves competition and loves higher levels of competition, and he usually struggles with motivation domestically. Like that's usually where he suffers. But when he gets to international stage, he always like turns it up a notch. And I imagine that a lot of the other teams will be, or the other members of the team will be excited as well. I think it's good for them that they're our second seed, because I think it gives them, while there is possibility for upset and embarrassment, I think having those extra stage games ahead of time and getting to see, like scrim and play against maybe competition that, you know, is a little more weighted in their favor. I don't know how optimistic you guys are feeling about GAM, but I'm feeling pretty good about Fnatic in that series, even against Loud, you know, and maybe just the GAM rematch. We'll see what the run back looks like. But like, I think that's big for them and their confidence. I would definitely be sweating more if like we just rolled up to main stage, they play their first best of 5, they get smashed. Like I'm immediately going to start being like, oh shit, like it's over. The doubt.
You got a good draw, I would say.
You did get a good draw.
I would say there's one team
side.
you don't want to draw, and it was drawn by FlyQuest. So God bless. Thank you, FlyQuest.
I'm really curious to hear your kind of take on. So for people in the LCS who say haven't watched a game of Fnatic since Worlds, obviously Trymbi is gone. They have Jun now. Talk to me about, you know, what he has done for the team, or maybe like what are some of the differences between, you know, this player and Trymbi, the Fnatic of old.
Yeah. All right. So first off, because I assume Dive viewers also watch the Dive State, we owe Chronicler an apology. It was a bad sales pitch. Turns out Jun is good. He is very good. When
he basically told us he was hot garbage.
he was like, he's good, trust me. But then everything he said was not good. He said
was horrible.
A million negative things. No, Jun's really good.
And Jun was smurfing in finals.
No,
he had so many insanely good plays, too. I was like, holy.
Absolute MVP in that finals.
Is it Jun or June, by the way?
I've always said Jun, but I'm worried now that I've been messing it up the entire year. So we'll double check. Yeah, but basically, so Trymbi's a super vocal player. And that's kind of like what he's known for. Also known to be, I think, a more emotional momentum kind of player. And we've seen some of that on Team Heretics, where he's found some success since then. Jun overall, like individually, has looked much stronger in the 2v2, and I think it's a little bit easier for Noah to work with another Korean player in the 2v2, even though both players have. Fnatic has done a really good job of integrating both players into the team, and Noah's English is like pretty great these days. I still think like their overall 2v2s look better. I think in Winter Split, Jun looked pretty solid individually, but it was like really clear that he wasn't 100% clicking with Razork or the team. Sometimes he would be making kind of plays on his own. Sometimes he'd be doing rotations on his own that would look like really good, where he would go to cover top, you know, on his reset as like a Nautilus. But then maybe the team wasn't ready and like weren't in position, or he would call something wrong and then Noah would overstep bot lane. I don't know if he was assuming that Jun was going to come bot lane, but there were like a lot of these little moments where even if you would argue for Jun's sake that like he was making the right move, it clearly wasn't all kind of coming together. And I think that really changed in spring. Like him and Razork talking, you can even see in Fnatic's kind of behind the scenes content, like that was a big focus for them. And it was a big focus for us as like pundits and analysts in LEC to see that really take off. And in playoffs, it really did. And so for me, this is a guy who knows his lane matchups, knows where he needs to be on the map, like resets and almost always picks the right spot for whether it's to cover a dive, whether it's to cover a gank. Like he is always where he needs to be. Does pretty well with Noah in the 2v2, and then like usually plays team fights pretty well. The game 1 versus G2, he's basically in my eyes the reason that Fnatic won, right? And like the game 2, I think he also played really well, even if like ultimately that game kind of slipped away from Fnatic. Like that was an all-star heroic performance from Jun, like super big highlight. But in generally, I think he's quietly been just really good, really reliable, and kind of like exactly what Fnatic needed from a especially from like an early game standpoint, because he works now. Razork isn't just kind of doing stuff on his own or just with humanoid. He has this other point that he can rely on in terms of like, the classic jungle support synergy, yada yada. But I don't think that always felt like it was the case with Trymbi in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, even during the BDS series, his Blitzcrank game, his Alistar game, I kept on going, oh my god, he's smurfing.
He's
so
really
I'm definitely
good.
impressed with him.
He's like good mechanically. He's Kobe. I'm really jazzed about Jun. Like, that's the easiest player to sell on Fnatic right now, which is insane because for the entire like 9 weeks leading up to the actual winter or spring finals and winter everything, I was just like Razork humanoid, Razork humanoid, Razork humanoid, Razork humanoid. So it's only in the last 3 weeks that I've been like Jun. It's just Jun. Guys, just watch Jun. It's all Jun all the time. This guy's sick.
Yeah, he was very good. I was gonna try and give you some more difficult assignment here afterwards, which to me I was like, Jun, yeah, that's an easy sell to me. I'm already bought in. Can you sell me on Oscar right now with the top lane competition at MSI? Because that to me, when I was watching these, I was most worried for.
Yeah, I think he was spared a bit because G2 swapped away. And he also, like, I think the thing about Oscar is that his Cassante is good, his Rek'Sai is good, his Zac is good. And he basically just played those 3 champions throughout playoffs, right? He hasn't played a whole lot else. I think last year we saw better looks from him after the first few disaster splits for Fnatic, where he, like, played some Jace games and really got to stand out. But this split, it just has not been there for him. He's been really sloppy. In games where he gets to counterpick or where he is kind of set up, where someone picks, like, I don't know, like something kind of useless into Zac, whatever it is going to be, where he gets to play one of these champions in an advantageous situation, he can like move across the map and make these big plays. But he, even in like the G2 series, he was getting kind of embarrassed, right? He's like TPing too early. G2 are instantly just dancing around him by TPing to the other side of the map. Like, Oscar has had a really rough split, and I would say a pretty rough year overall. Like, there are some really great standout games on Cassante where he's like not only winning his lane, but he's building things like Locket. He's building all these defensive items for the team, and he just feels like he's the perfect top laner that everybody dreams of. But those games have been super few and far between. He's not winning a lot of lanes outside of his comfort pick. He's not doing very well in team fights, and in map movements, like Fnatic as a whole are a little bit messy, so he doesn't really get a shine there either. I think if you have to talk about a weakness for this team right now, it's probably Oscar, and then after that, it's probably Noah. But to me, the 3-man core of like Jun, Razork, and Humanoid are the only players that I really feel I can rely on when we start to talk about bigger levels of competition.
So to talk about those bigger levels of competition, you talked about expectations for G2. You said success for G2 is winning a BO5 versus an LCK or LPL team. What is success for Fnatic then at MSI?
I think it's competitive best of 5, and I think it's definitely not losing to North America. You're not allowed to lose to North America, which is also true of G2 to be fair, but I'm willing to skip over that for G2 and just pretend like it's all good.
You have to set realistic expectations. Maybe they could take down
Energy's
the LCK
not there.
or
They might have
LPL,
a
but
chance.
can they take down the LCS?
Bro, I'm actually like, I'm worried because like I think FlyQuest are kind of sloppy, but I think that like Blippo Inspired are pretty scary, right? They've played here a decent amount of times. I don't super love the Oscar into Blippo matchup. That doesn't sound great. The rest of the map I'm not that worried about. Got a lot of faith about Humanoid into Jensen, but then I look at TL and I'm like, that's gonna be a toughie. You're gonna out Cassante Impact. Like, we're going to tank matchup versus Impact and just pretend it's all going to be okay, and your bot lane's actually good. And, like, I don't really have strong feelings on APA because I just feel like your entire league is fraudulent for not prioritizing ASOL higher. But jungle also a little bit scary. So, look, I still think Fnatic win, but I'm definitely more nervous about TL than I am about FlyQuest overall.
I'm more nervous about G2 than I am about Fnatic, so
I think, I would say that's
right back at
fair.
you, buddy.
That's pretty fair. Yeah.
Our number 1 seeds are better than our number 2 seeds.
Well, okay, it's good to know that you feel that way, because I was like, some parts of that FlyQuest series for your guys' finals, I was just like, what are FlyQuest doing? Like, they're just over.
Well, did you watch much FlyQuest throughout the regular season or not? Because FlyQuest was definitely way worse in the finals. They kind of biffed it in the finals for sure. I mean, like, their bot lane is really young. Busio was horrible in the finals, I think, compared to how he normally plays. So I don't know if it was
Jensen
like the best.
too.
Jensen too.
Yeah,
I mean,
Jensen
was all in
stuff
supportive
was...
champions. I mean, they were just a mess in finals.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna ask. Is because like to me, it's like the version of FlyQuest that I saw in previous rounds of playoffs, and I think the Cloud9 series was also like a little bit one-sided and also it's kind of fraudulent just because it seemed like Cloud9 imploded. But even just the first TL FlyQuest series, they looked so much better, right? And yeah, the Jensen Annie picks were suspect to me. Like, I don't know.
It was training weights, man. You're telling us and selling us on these G2 or putting the training weights on themselves. We were doing the same thing.
Their weights were just a little bit too heavy, so they lost.
Wait, I'm sorry. Was TL putting the training weights on and then they took them off, or did FlyQuest put the training weights on for the finals?
Was putting training weights on, but they were trying to do a 1-rep max, but it was too heavy,
I got it. Jensen was like, how funny would it be if I beat APA with Annie, a champion who doesn't do anything against Aurelion Sol, probably the best mid laner on the patch. No, I got you. If it had worked, it would have been sick.
Was training.
Yeah, it would have been funny, but it wasn't. It's definitely it'll be fun. I'm excited for the matchups. Obviously, I think LCS LEC fans really want to see their teams take down the other region. So I think it's going to be a really good time, and I'm excited to see you at MSI. Thank you so much, Drakos, for taking the time out of your evening to come to give us the lowdown, and we can now pass on all that we have learned to our teams. And take credit for any victories.
It's cool. I already passed on all the details on Team Liquid. One thing I will say, okay, final note. Everyone makes the same docu-series. Fnatic gives away way too much in their docu-series. I learned nothing about Team Liquid like behind the scenes watching the Team Liquid docu-series. It's good content.
You probably know their favorite boba and stuff, though.
Yeah, they're probably... Look... But I know so much more about Fnatic. Fnatic are just out here dropping bombs.
Yeah,
no,
I was like, this is a hot tip.
That's
this
gotta
is
be
like
fake,
I'm
though.
just
I
like
bet you they're
either
planting
Team Liquid
fake
either
strats
open
in
up
their
or Fnatic need to
docuseries.
chill. That's all I'm saying.
I will say, when Bwipo was on Fnatic, that was the first time I met him. I remember talking to him in the LEC studio, and I was just like, "Oh, hey, Bwipo, nice to meet you." And he's like, "So, this is what we were thinking in draft last game," and it was at a Rift Rivals, and he just like told me their entire drafting strategy for the next games, and I'm like, "I'm not gonna go leak this." But you probably shouldn't be telling me this much information.
You know, that's crazy because last I checked, what's this Bwipo plays for an NA team? We've got him on Discord. I'll hit him up and be like, tell me what you were thinking, Bwipo. How does it work?
All right. Well, thanks a lot, man. Appreciate you coming in, and we will see you in China.
Sounds good, boys. Talk to you later.
All right, welcome our LPL correspondent, Emily. I'm very excited for this one.
LPL correspondent, actually LCK correspondent,
Yeah.
LEC correspondent. Emily is actually a League of Legends robot.
It's
she
in
turns
Uno.
on-
I have that
She
reputation.
activates
don't I?
anytime League of Legends is being played. She doesn't actually sleep.
She's our wild card. Like, all right, we need a correspondent for.
CBLOL,
Boom, there you go.
PCS.
Yeah.
Activated. So
LPL.
introduce yourself because the dive viewers definitely don't.
Oh
know.
yeah. So I'm Emily. I'm actually on the LCS broadcast.
Whoa!
But yeah, I've watched all of LPL. So
Yeah,
Probably every single game.
yeah. There are some
Even the ones you shouldn't be watching.
No, yeah, there are some times where I definitely came into early call time for LCS, and I was like, man, really shouldn't have watched that like TT game.
Yeah, you're watching like 12th place at 5 a.m. and you're like, did you catch the game last night? I'm like, Emily, that was 3 hours ago. No, I did not catch the game. I was asleep.
But I did get you to watch FPX, so
Yeah.
I feel like I win.
You did. I love watching LPL. I watch the good teams, just not always live. Sometimes the next day.
late.
Yeah, exactly. But obviously we have BLG just won. Top, they're going as well. Let's start with Top, since they're the second seed. That's what we've been doing. Talk to us about this team a little bit and kind of what their split has been like.
Yeah, so I think the big thing going into this year, just generally for LPL, that I'd want to say is that there was some shakeup in terms of the top teams, which there kind of always is. But
the
there was
JDG solo laners.
there was
band broke up.
the Knight Yagao trade, which has been happening unironically over the past several years. They've both kind of been at the top, but then with Top Esports, I think the big thing to point out is Creme coming up, kind of matriculating up from OMG to here, 369, and then obviously Mako is a huge one because he is
one
One
supports
of,
all
if
time.
not the best support the
Jackie gets a
LPL has
good
ever
support
had.
to play with?
Yeah, this is
Oh
what everyone
my.
was saying. Is like, no offense to Jackie Love's previous supports, but like finally,
But like a little
finally,
bit of offense.
you Balan hater, Kobe. No.
I mean, it's really hard to say, wow, he finally got a good support and not give offense to
yeah, true.
People he
true.
won a world championship.
So hard.
Hasn't Balan suffered enough? All right. So Mako coming to this team was massive, right? Like not just because Jackie Love getting a quote unquote good support, but also just Mako leaving EDG, the team he had been with since he initially debuted. Yeah, he had never been on another team outside of, I think, LDL teams. Yeah, he was on Ray Union before, but then he was entirely in the EDG system since 2015 or late 2014.
I think actually the biggest biggest one to me is the 369 one because everyone is talking about the JDG mid laner swap because most people favored Knight, but getting 369 is insane value here for TES, and this man with the changes that we saw from Bin this year also, I feel like a lot of people are on the 369 best top laner in the world like train now.
Yeah, I mean, I've intermittently been on that train for a while. I think the big thing that I always gave credit to 369 over the past like few years is that he did come in as kind of the quintessential LPL top laner where he's like, I'm going to hands diff you. I don't necessarily have a brain when it comes to the game. And he really, I mean, obviously everyone remembers that Karsa clip where he was getting, 369 was getting kind of massacred by Karsa after a loss. But he really took a lot of feedback to heart and became just an incredible top laner. Like, I think he's really, really intelligent with the way he approaches team fights in particular. He can play a wide variety of styles. And I think a lot of the big ups in terms of teams he has been on with their team fighting is a lot of unseen things that 369 is able to do on a variety of champions.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's always really impressed me is that it's like you say, he came in as the carry guy, but then there's been times where it's like he's just been one-tricking Ornn and dominating just as hard, right? Like he can play truly like every style, and I think when you think about most of the elite top laners, they are pretty heavily favoring one style or the other. It's like Bin Ornn is almost a meme, right? And you think of certain players, you really associate them, okay, this is the carry guy or this is the tank guy. 369 has had times where it's like an entire split is like almost only carry, then the next split or next year is like only tank, and then he's back to carries and he's doing just as well again. And I think that is pretty insane.
Yeah, and I mean, he even brought out the Urgot in this past playoffs, which I thought was actually a really smart pick.
It's really good to top
yeah,
SI.
so I think 369 is a big deal. I also think, again, like Jackie Love being partnered with Mako has been really interesting to watch. I wasn't initially sold on it. No, I wasn't initially sold on it, but now I think they're really good together,
Yeah, I
so.
mean, it's so fun like reviewing top games and like progressively going back earlier and earlier in the season, because there are, when I'm looking at ways for, I'm always kind of looking at it from the perspective of how can our North American teams, take down these teams and take down these juggernauts.
I can pull some Jackie Love clips for you.
I mean,
I have identified two possible strategies.
All right.
The
Alright,
number
hit
one
me.
is Jackie Love will always position as aggressively as possible as an AD carry, and he also did some flashes where like he was flashing forward into them, and then they would not even be in his vision, and they would be in brush, and then he wouldn't be able to get off anything, and he'd die. Or like his their regular season game where they played versus NIP, and he flashes backwards onto the Aphelios like Rumble ultimate, whatever that spell is called. There's too many Aphelios ultimates
Inferno?
called. Yeah, and then dies to it. Like Jackie Love is one where you can try and pressure, because there will also be points where Tien and Creme in that same series, just because this one's so fresh in my mind because I was just watching like their last regular season games. They sent Tien and Creme up top and they ganked and they killed the top laner, but at the exact same time, Mako and Jackie Love were at enemy tower on bottom lane on like quote unquote weak side, and they both die to enemy jungler, like they're always playing aggressively and pushing up. So if we can try and identify points where enemy jungle or enemy mid is not going to be bottom, and we can try and punish him for being so aggressive, like that is definitely a way. The other one I saw was sometimes Tien also feels like he's just got ego or something, where he plays into whatever the opponent's strongest part of the map is, and he just goes in anyway. And then if it doesn't work, then he'll just sometimes we'll keep repeating that. Most of the games he's a smurf. I'm like, oh my god, like we're doomed. But those two players, sometimes there are definitely angles where we can identify these may be points that we can try and pick up some dubs on.
Emily, talk to us a little bit about Creme, because he's obviously a bit of a lesser known player.
Yeah.
And kind of his development this year. Because one of the things, like, I didn't watch a lot of Creme games in the past, to be honest. But I know that he was always known as like this really aggressive player, and then his control mages have historically just been garbage. But like this year, he had a lot of really good Karma games, a lot of good, really good Hui games, and it feels like he's kind of developing as a player.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing with Creme is I always like when you can see players end up, again, kind of rising through the ranks, being really good on a team like OMG, which is like a really young, fun team to watch last year. But then obviously in a league like LPL, you'll want those players to eventually move up to continue to grow. And this is a really good team for him to grow on. He has an incredibly experienced jungler in Tien, obviously an incredibly experienced bot laner for all of the positives and negatives about Jackie Love. And then, like we said, one of the best supports LPL has ever had, potentially one of the best supports all time in League of Legends in Mako and 369. So essentially he has like this incredibly veteran team around him with a lot of experience. And I think, like, I don't want to take away from him as an individual, but I think this is a perfect environment for him to continue to improve on a lot of things that aren't just like mechanics, right? Because I think when you look at especially solo laners coming up in the LPL, kind of like we already mentioned with 369, that's what you really want to be looking for as like the next stage of growth, because most of them come in with really strong mechanics, right? And that's what people noticed about Creme initially from his initial LPL debut.
So, like, how do you look at this team, like, overall, as far as, like, their comparison to some of the other teams that they'd be playing at MSI? Because I know, obviously, it's early days, but I'm starting to see people pop up their tier lists, and it always feels like, okay, TES is put below all the other LPL and LCK teams. Sometimes they're even put below G2. You know, Drakos was just on talking about LEC, and he's like, well, you know, success for G2 is beating an LPL LCK team, which means we need to match up against top because, you know, they're the team we could beat. Do you kind of agree with a lot of those criticisms? Do you see them as that kind of like ugly duckling of the you know, four teams?
I don't actually, but I think my big thing with top esports is that it's tough to say this after watching their final, because outside of game one, I actually don't think you saw it in the finals. Against BLG, they kind of fell apart even when they had, like, in my opinion, compositional advantages or map advantages. But I do think they're a deceptively smart team about their lane assignments. I think if lane swaps continue to be a thing at MSI, I know you were talking to Drakos about that and whether lane swaps are a thing that a team like G2 just does to cover their early game, right? I don't necessarily think that's always the case. I think you can just swap to get a better lane matchup. And I think TES have been throughout the season really smart about a lot of their lane assignments, which is why I'd push back on Kobe's way to like beat them. Is like, well, Jackie Love just ints. But I do think you might see this team be able to shift for better lane assignments. And I think that's an underrated aspect of them, is their map play, because I don't see a lot of people talk about it.
So yeah, and I just want to clarify too for the Jackie Love thing. Like it's not like a if Jackie Love ends, it's a specifically target this player because he is going to use his flash so frequently and still position for like highest damage. that is, if you can put a
Yeah.
target on him and like craft your strategy around putting pressure on him, I think that's
That's how you can have some of these insane moments.
Yeah,
too, right?
I
Where
don't
it's
I don't
like-
disagree with that. I do think
He
Jackie
plays
Love is
the nice
always going to
edge.
play that way. Yeah.
And some of them too, I think he gets like, because people like to jump on that bandwagon and always be like,
Sometimes he does
"Uh-huh."
have some colossal wins
Yeah,
in his career.
but-
though.
He
the-
had a few in finals
Yeah.
too, which I think, like, again, if you're an LCS viewer and you're only watching LPL finals and you're like, oh man, Jackie Love, even though he had, like, in my opinion, a really good split.
Yeah.
Like, he had a really, really good split.
There are some where he gets criticized that I think are like people aren't giving enough context or enough credit. Like the one where it was the last NIP game where the Nautilus hooks into the wall and then Jackie moves up on his Senna, you know,
Yeah.
and he's like damaging. You can remember this play so clearly because then he gets hooked in by the Nautilus.
Yeah.
But that's because like the cooldown on your hook gets reduced by half if it hits a wall. And so he's calculating the regular like, oh, Nautilus just
Yeah.
used hook and now it's going to be down for another 4 seconds. Jackie wants to make use of every single second to go get the extra damage while you're walking away, even if like he's not going to kill you then, he wants to get that health advantage. And it's just like this miscalculation of he forgot because the hook hit the wall, it's going to be 4 less seconds.
Yeah.
And so he didn't get his normal like extra couple of autos out. But it's like that mentality of wanting to use every second to harass for every little bit of damage, I think is admirable, but also something that we should target.
Yeah.
I did kind of want to ask you as well, like what is the best way to attack them in draft? Because I was looking at that patch and I was like, this is one of the teams that
It's a
probably
great patch for them.
I think they
man.
benefit the most
Yeah.
of any team with
You-
like Creme Akali getting some extra health anyways.
You got the Akali and Silas buffs.
Jackie
You got
Love
the
Draven.
Draven buffs, which he was already doing pretty well on. You got the TN J4 buffs.
I'm just like, they got mega buffed on this patch. I feel like draft gets a big bonus for top. So when you're talking about everyone putting top esports so far down, I also am like, man, I don't think they're gonna be as easy as
I don't think so either.
People think that they are gonna be.
Especially in the regular season, I felt like this team was really good, right? And like the previous series against BLG was really competitive as well. I definitely can understand it more. I think if you just watched finals and then saw, okay, that series felt more one-sided. Maybe they're
yeah.
not that good. Maybe they're
Yeah.
making more mistakes. But I don't think it's like a fair representation of what they look like throughout the year.
I also think when you come up against, and this isn't to say that like they don't play bot lane aggressively, right? Or they don't play aggressively, because I think they do. But when you go up against a team like BLG and a team like BLG wins based on the way they want to play, which I'm sure we'll talk about very shortly, it's going to look very dominant, right?
Yeah.
By comparison, just based on their play style, in my opinion. So I think there's a lot of stuff on this patch that's really good for TES. I do think if you are looking at how they have lost a lot of times, it is through some of their neutral objective setups, and specifically a lot of 5v5 team fighting, right? Like, because when it came down to them going up against BLG, when BLG were able to make things either more volatile on purpose or like flat out 5v5 them in situations, that's where I think they faltered a bit more.
Something I'm honestly just terrified of the LPL teams with, and this is not even just like a top or a BLG exclusive thing. I think both these teams do it well, but just in the LPL, watching throughout playoffs and especially in playoffs, it felt like these teams are so willing to just like fight to the death at level 1 in bot lane and like able to create, such monumental advantages so early. Like they will force you to trade in a disadvantageous matchup, or you're not going to get XP, in bot lane, just like right from the get-go at level 1. And then they use this to then get prio, and then now is all of a sudden you're chunked, and now all of a sudden they're setting up a dive. And like BLG obviously is really famous for doing this, but like I think top bot lane does this really well as well. And this is something that I just think a lot of the international teams, especially the Western teams, are really going to struggle with, because you just don't see that level of early game aggression and bot lane 2v2s, really ever happen, it feels like, or at least it's very uncommon to see that, in NA and in EU at that level, where it's just like these players in bot lane just seem to know the matchup so well. They're so confident, and they're just going to force every single advantage. It's like, I cannot count the amount of games I watched throughout LPL playoffs this year where it's just like level 1, it's 145 into the game and 3 or 4 summoners are missing bot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when everyone's doing it over there, you get so much more experience doing it. So you really learn like the little nuances of the matchup, being like, okay, you know, if everyone hits all their spells, like we'll win this. If you dodge one thing, all of a sudden it's different. But like if you haven't seen it at all, like you're gonna have a really rough time going up against people with that much knowledge. So yeah, if I was going up against them, I would hope for some like, you know, chill matchups.
Farm it out.
Yo, let's get like a good scaling team.
I mean, I did bring up, so like, I think TES would be willing to do this too, and BLG to some extent. I do think that, again, we'll see how frequently people want to do this strategy, but I don't think lane swaps are a bad idea if you want to get away from having a disastrous 2v2.
I think they're a very good idea.
And you want to have a hyper
Nah,
carry.
this is
Then
old league,
the
though.
problem is if you still might have to face one of these teams in 5v5 team fighting
Where they also
if they also have hyper carry.
But I would rather
tough part.
face them in a 5-on-5 team fight
At even gold.
without a 5,000
Yeah,
gold
yeah,
deficit.
exactly.
so
Excellent point.
that's why I was like, yeah, when I was
Yeah.
watching these, to your point on the bottom lane, like the early advantages also, they would always even turn into their own 2v2 dives. I don't know if we had any of our bottom lanes ever do their own 2v2 dive without calling jungler. I actually
probably did.
I actually, thinking back through this whole split, the only one I would say maybe would have done it would be Yon and Core JJ, but I think most of their 2v2 kills came from like chasing someone from the middle of their lane.
Thought NRG had a few, but not
Successfully. Yeah.
successfully.
But it's like so many of these games with especially BLG, it's like like you're saying, they get an early advantage and then they're like, we're stacking this wave. I don't care. No jungler. Boom. We're doing our dive. And even if like my support dies in the process, they kill the AD carry.
Deny
He can't
the
farm the
XP.
big wave.
Yeah.
You
That's
know,
worth.
it's like, I was like, holy moly. The bottom lane is truly brutal in the LPL.
So let's talk about BLG a bit, Emily. Obviously, Knight won MVP. You know, left JDG. Well, JDG's not going to MSI. Knight won the LPL again with BLG. You know, looked incredibly good. I felt like he was such a difference maker against basically every mid laner he was playing against in the LPL playoffs. It felt like. But you know, what are your kind of expectations for BLG and talk a little bit about their season, how they've looked?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because he had a comparatively quiet grand finals, I think. But in terms of BLG, obviously Knight coming onto the team is the big thing, like you said. I'd want to call out Bin as someone who I think has followed the 369 trajectory, which is very interesting to me. I do think he's improved a lot in terms of his map awareness and his team fighting, which is something to watch out for. I still don't think he's necessarily as well-rounded as 369 in certain places, but I do think his laning is so incredibly dominant, and he's such a difficult player to go up against. I think if you are a top laner or talking to a lot of top laners, they always cite Bin as, if you go to internationals, as the one that is the most difficult player to go up against, just because of the way he plays the lane. I think the other big thing that I'd want to call out, and you kind of already brought it up with the way they do set up bot lane dives, like this team is so sometimes clinical about the way they want to play their early game in a very, very aggressive way. I think they were the best early game team in the LPL this year. And I think a lot of their power comes from the way that they do play around Elk and On, who also had a phenomenal
It feels like
grand
one of the
finals
first times
as well.
Elk has been getting a lot of credit as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think, like, if you want to touch on, like, a small narrative point here, I think winning that finals really meant a ton to him, right? Because back when he was, you know, Jomong on WE, he then went to Ultra Prime, and
Playing
everyone
behind,
thought
like,
his
Mystic and
career
stuff,
was,
right?
like, done. Yep. And then now he is on this BLG team and finally was able to win.
And was first
An
team
LPL
All-Pro
title.
and whatnot.
Yep.
I don't know if you agreed with that, but he won it.
I think it's both, right? I think he's improved a lot. And then I also think BLG, and the other thing that makes them a super dangerous team at MSI as well, is that they know how to play around him very, very well, either in these compositions where they're going to have a really hard force 2v2 bot, Or even, I think, and this goes back to even as far as last year at MSI, I think they have a really good understanding of how to play Jinx hypercarry comps and like other hypercarry comps with Elk as well, to make the most of his mechanical outplays. So I think this team functionally knows how to play around Elk incredibly well.
I definitely love how they've kind of all come together around him, because at the end of last MSI, everybody was praising his mechanics, but they were still talking about some of the decisions that he makes can definitely cost the team. But I think him and On especially has improved so much. Like On to me in some of the recent series, except for the Kalista support game. The Kalista support is kind of useless. The other ones, he was insane with the openings that he was able to create. Like
I would have voted him finals MVP actually.
His support, the support Nico. If you remember support Nico, who he tried to play at Worlds, and
Nope, I can't recall. I don't recall that. Doesn't ring a bell.
And then you're watching finals on support Nico. Was like 300 times better than Palafox's mid lane Nico with the initiations and the blastings that he was getting. I was just like, oh my god, this is just crazy. Like the confidence that they have in each other, how they've grown as a duo, to me is one of the coolest things. Because off of last MSI, everyone was complimenting Elk on like, oh my god, his flash reactions, all of his reaction speeds have always been, pinnacle. But now it seems like, to your point of like playing with the rest of the team, and the rest of the team like having confidence in him and also like creating openings for him with their CC. I'm like, if they have any champions with CC on the team, like it's so scary to play against him.
I think it's always so interesting to me too, because I've been watching Knight for years and years and years. Like I started watching Knight a lot when he was just absolutely going crazy on Syndra, because I was doing like this video on Syndra. So I started watching all his games when he had this huge undefeated streak on Syndra, and then he's just gone through all these different cycles, I feel like, of having these champions that are just like legendary status. And now it's his Ahri, right? Where he had 100% win rate on his Ahri, a 30-something KDA. He bought Magi's in every single game he played on Ahri this year and didn't lose a single one. And it's just like,
that's pretty good.
It's just crazy, like the level of confidence and how he plays with Shun. Obviously, like a lot of it is about these aggressive combos that they use, like a lot of like Vi Ahri and these types of things. And I think they do such a good job of being able to pressure their lanes without always like giving up a lot on the other side of the map as well, right? Like they all seem to play for the maximum. They do a really good job of using Shun to be able to track the enemy jungle, which I think allows Knight and Bin and Elk and everyone to kind of be playing on that knife's edge quite a lot, and allows them to really have that best early game in the LPL, right? Because it's like all the lanes are going to play for the most. No one is really giving too much respect to the enemy jungle, and that allows Shun to then get in the enemy jungle's face, invade, take away camps, play with his mid laner, set up these dives, and it all just works together so well as this kind of cohesive unit, which makes BLG to me the most frightening team in the world. I just think they're a team that could, even at like the MSI level, even at the like top LCK and LPL level, they can blow you out in the early game, right? Like they could blow some of these teams out of the water before anything really has happened as far as like 5v5s.
Yeah, I think that is kind of the point I was making with the grand finals too, is where like when BLG are able to just dominate you so hard, it looks more even more lopsided than like it actually is in certain cases. And then I think you can also point to game 1 as a kind of a comeback game for them, where they're like, okay, we are going to use these openings with Elk's Lucian. I know like a lot of people are pointing out his stellar Lucian plays like mid to late game, but I actually thought TES for the most part had better map movements in that game. And BLG just found windows to be able to team fight with, obviously, Talia set up around objectives, and then making the most of Elk's solution, and Elk just having some phenomenal mechanical plays. So that's the thing that where BLG's team fighting is so good, because so many players on this team could just step up mechanically at the right times.
I wanted to bring up the Azir topic for Knight, because you're like, oh my god, his Syndra, legendary, his Ahri, legendary, his Azir, for so long has been the opposite of legendary because he just doesn't play it, right? And it's such a popular champion. While he started picking it, I don't think it was bad, but it wasn't this like S+ tier of a lot of other Knight champions. So if we're again always trying to look at like, especially this team is the hardest to do it because they're probably tournament, they're one of the tournament favorites depending on your tier list. But like on ways that we could try and attack them, I would like if we always leave open Azir and he picks it. Like it wasn't a bad Azir. He had one bad game, I thought. But I think it's a win if he's on that rather than being on Ahri or being, on one of these like S+ like Knight is so godlike, especially with Azir getting the small nerf. I think like maybe that's like one way into it. Again, this is the hardest team for us.
I'm listening. I mean, I'm all ears.
I'm like,
because I can't see anyways.
I think you have to get again. Like I know I keep bringing up lane swapping, but I think BLG is. If you're gonna lane swap against any team,
no, I
think
I would do that every single game. I don't want to lane against Falcon.
Like it's like clockwork, like how they're gonna stack that bot wave and then try to dive you, regardless of whether Shun is there or not.
They just go for these crazy aggressive dives. They execute them so well, and it's even like these trade kills that they're always willing to take trade kills, right? Where it's like every single time, they'll go for a 3-2. There's even some of these games in the LPL where it's like 2 of them will die, but their AD doesn't die, but they killed the enemy AD.
Doesn't matter.
And it doesn't matter because they denied this whole stacked wave. The enemy support got 2 kills. Who cares? They can't really do anything with it.
Yeah, and it still gets Elk ahead. I think that is like if there's any team that I would suggest people lane swap against and like
suggest not laning
pick
against
a hyper carry, pick a hyper carry, lane swap, and then hope you're able to get out of it by being able to beat them in team fights and like map rotations. Because that is where I think like you've seen BLG falter occasionally is where again like TES I actually do think did this against them a few times in both of their series where they were actually able to have way better tempo on the map and kind of drag BLG around a bit.
Yeah, that first one where Bin was on TF and then they try and match it. Like Bin even ghosts to try and match. And like they see the lane swap late with that ward on red buff and they're trying to catch. But I 100% agree. If they are spending time walking between lanes, then that's already a dub.
They're not spending time beating your ass.
There was that,
I'm like, that's a dub!
There was that super egregious one where they just slowly, it was in the first BLG TES series, they just slowly take so much time walking up the river, and I'm just like, That I think is your best window as an NA team into trying to beat BLG.
It kind of feels like BLG's gonna choke though, because there's like so much hype around him, and making them sound like it's like you can't be on the same screen as them. They're gonna kill you everywhere. Like I don't know. Like they're still playing the same game. Like they don't have hacks installed as far as I know. I don't know. I mean, we'll see. I just every time I hear this much glaze about a team, it's like I don't know. It's hard to live up to that.
I do think you can outsmart them. Like honestly, I think they've improved in their map play, but I do think a team. I mean, more specifically, no offense, LCS teams, I love you. I'm thinking of like a GenG, or a TES or a T1, someone who's able to have.
I don't think that they're unbeatable
tempo,
for the other LCK
on the
and
map.
LPL teams, but I do think it would be really hard for me to see an LCS or LEC team ever winning a series against them. Like
that's true with most.
Yeah.
But most internationals.
Yeah, no, it is true.
The only window based on playstyle I'd say is maybe G2 if they like execute their macro perfectly. Because I actually think G2, because of the fact that people are so down on Europe this year, I actually think they're going into this tournament with their actual map movements a little underrated in terms of the way they play the mid game.
It's interesting too because there are still a decent amount of people on the LCK side and having the advantage for LCK. Even though in our last, call-in, I was also on the side of like, oh my god, I feel like BLG with the matchups and with the way FaZe is playing, like it just sounds a horror show for GenG.
Ox was not sounding confident.
But I definitely, there are still people putting GenG above both LPL teams. And some people put GenG and T1 both above them. it's like when you get to an international tournament, I can see that happening, because we have seen, LCK get the advantage over it. Usually it's not at MSIs.
I can see that Worlds.
Usually,
MSI is the LPLs.
Exactly. Usually it's not at MSIs though, where LPL has huge historical advantage.
So, what would you say for these two teams then, Emily? What does success look like? Like, is the bar you have to win the MSI where it's a failure for both top and BLG, or like what would you say you define success as?
I mean, I would say if you ask the LPL and like these teams, absolutely. I think for BLG, I think they're a little bit more expected. So I would say for BLG, it's win. Yeah. And then for TES, for me, I would put it as a success. I would put it as a success if they make it to like the grand finals. Because I do think there are a little bit more weaknesses in terms of their gameplay, but I do want to say that I think where people are underrating them actually is in their map movements. And if there's anything that someone could get out of me talking about TES here, that's where I'd say, because I think that is also what they kind of flubbed, unfortunately, in grand finals, and I'd want to see more of what I saw from them throughout playoffs and regular season at MSI, hopefully.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Emily.
No, thanks for having me.
You had any final thing?
You gotta
Appreciate
go.
you coming on. I gotta get my stitches out, so I don't have my Frankenstein thumb for MSI. About to. Well, I'm sure that's gonna be fun. Anyway, yeah, appreciate you having you on,
thank you.
and thank you for all the insight on the LPL.